Good evening. Welcome to tonight's CitySpeak Forum. I'm Corvallis Advocate Editor Stevie Beiswanger, and co-moderating with me tonight is our publisher, Steve Schultz. This evening, we will first focus on current Art Center exhibit, I Am My White Ancestors, Claiming Legacy of Oppression by artist Anne Mavor. Mavor examines her own family's history dating back hundreds of years. The exhibit is currently open for viewing by appointment only at the Corvallis Art Center. Next, we'll look at how racial oppression has played out in this country up to present day, with a specific focus on policing. Steve?
Thank you, Stevie. CitySpeak is presented by the Corvallis Advocate, which offers daily news online and in non-pandemic times, a twice-monthly deep dive print publication, along with live forums and storytelling nights. CitySpeaks, are co-presented by the City Club of Corvallis, a volunteer-run nonprofit organization seeking to present a diversity of viewpoints and constructive dialogue. We also want to thank our sponsors for making this evening possible. First Alternative Natural Food Co-op, Peak Sports Downtown Corvallis, and the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition. Stay tuned for CitySpeak's next month, one that is prominently on our minds, the Climate Crisis CitySpeak, scheduled for the 14th. Already a very strong panel. You can support forums like these by donating or subscribing to the Corvallis Advocate. We can't put these programs on without our sponsors, donors, and specifically you, our subscribers. If you're not subscribing, please consider that you are consuming this content without taking care of the people that work hard behind the scenes to produce it. You can remedy that by subscribing. The base level gets you unlimited online access, and it's only $5 per month. Stevie.
Thanks, Steve. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce this evening's panelists. Joining us tonight are Anne Mavor, the artist exhibiting I Am My White Ancestors, Angel Harris, the NAACP chapter president for Corvallis and Albany, Corvallis Police Chief Sassaman, Professor Randy Blazak, a hate crimes and gender studies author and expert, the Benton County District Attorney John Haroldson, and Faye Stetz-Waters, the Oregon Department of Justice Director of Civil Rights. We would also like to give a quick shout out to Art Center board members Elizabeth and Chris Bell for sponsoring Ms. Mavor's exhibit. The Bells express a deep appreciation of Mavor's exploration into her ancestry's historical connections to white privilege. To our panelists, thank you all so much for taking the time out of what must be incredibly busy schedules. In a few moments, we'll turn to audience questions. To ask a question while we're live, viewers are welcome to comment on the event's live Facebook post on our page, The Corvallis Advocate, or email us at cityspeak@corvallisadvocate.com. Again, that is cityspeak@corvallisadvocate.com. We'll move to those questions at about 7:30. For now, we're going to start with some introductory questions from our editorial board. And the first questions are directed toward artist Anne Mavor, exhibiting I Am My White Ancestors. Again, that's at the Art Center. Anne, can you describe your artistic process for this exhibit? What inspired you to create it?
Sure. I'm going to just hide myself so I'm not distracted by looking at myself. So what was the question? How did I come to do the project?
Sure. How were you inspired to create the project, and what was your process doing so?
Well, it was a long process. It took about 20 years of preparation, but really, as I was telling you the other week, it was a Native American leader who actually told me straight out, don't focus on our culture, go and claim your own culture. And at that point, I was looking for a project to do, and I had this a vision of doing a project where I was collaborating with a Native artist, and we were both looking at our respective sacred sites. And so I had to abandon that project instantly, and I went home and asked myself the question: what would it look like if I claimed my own people? And I had the vision of the project, which is at the Art Center, of all the ancestors. I was going to wear the costumes. I was going to embody each character. And the purpose really was to look at the source of racism and other oppressions, because each of the characters goes into a oppression and how they came to oppress. And I was really wanted to have this personal experience, because that's how I do work. It's always my own experience, and I wanted to feel what it was like to be that ancestor, to understand why they did what they did, and then to also understand how those patterns and beliefs and messages were passed down to me. And I was able to actually see that very clearly. So that's the short version.
Perfect. That segues to our next question. So what was the emotional journey, or how did this project affect you personally? And are there any ancestors or oppressions that stuck out in particular to you?
Oh, there are so many. It was amazing to feel connected to my past. Many of us white people really don't know our backgrounds, and we don't know where the beliefs we have came from. But I now know, and it's really powerful, because I know. What I noticed in general is that I can see racism in particular better now, because I know who I am, and I know what my patterns are, and I can see when I am racist, and it's such a joy, and I'm so grateful that I can actually see it instead of it being not conscious, which is how most white people operate, just like completely blind to what we're doing. But one of the ancestors was the pilgrim who was born in Plymouth Plantation in 1623, Desire Howland Gorham. And what I learned about that culture is when a child is, when there's another child born, the older child is taken away. And so there's this separation that happens. And that's exactly what happened to me when I was 3 years old, and my sister was born. My grandmother took me on a train ride to South Carolina, and I went away from the family. So right away, I was disconnected from my sister. So that kind of disconnection is inherent, or not inherent, endemic in many of the white and specifically Protestant families and cultures.
Thank you. And one last question. What do you hope people that go see this exhibit, again, it's by appointment at the Arts Center. I highly encourage anyone in Corvallis to get out there and see it. What do you hope people take away from this exhibit?
I hope that they will talk to their families. I hope that they will look at their own lives and see what patterns that they may have learned from their families, and to talk about white supremacy really, and to be curious about it, and not do what we've always done, which is never talk about it because we feel so bad, or we never talk about it because we don't even notice it, but it's everywhere.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to move to Angel Harris, who again is the NAACP chapter president for Corvallis in Albany. Angel, similar to Anne's exhibit, what other ways have you seen people work to claim and overcome their own legacies of oppression? Or also, how can people do this productively, in your view?
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you so much for the words that you spoke. I think it's important, like Anne said, to really evaluate yourselves. I heard it recently as a concentric circle, right? And so sometimes I think we want to start like way out here and big, right? And so sometimes we have to start here, start with our families, and work our way out, because we forget, I think a lot of times we forget ourselves because it's uncomfortable to think about our own biases and our own racism. And so when I am fighting against the system that was created to keep me as a Black person out, I need so bad for white people to understand how that affects them, and how it impacts them personally as well, if that makes sense, right? And so I want us to know that this is a system. Racism is systemic, it's structural, it's in the very fabric of this country. But we also need to understand that it's not just out there, but a lot of times it's right here. And so if you haven't, I just want to just recommend that you go to the Art Center and you see that exhibit, and not just see it, but really take it in, because this is Anne's story, but I think it's so many other white people's stories, right? And so I always say, if you don't know what the problem is, it's going to be hard to fight for something that you don't really understand what the real problem is. And so that it's uncomfortable. Sometimes you have to sit with the pain, the grief. Oppression is heavy, right? To see the history of not even just the history, but even the things that are happening today, it is heavy stuff, right? And sometimes we need to sit in that to know the impact of that. So I would first say, start with yourself. As you are trying to change the system, make sure you're not forgetting to change yourself.
Thank you. And kind of to segue a little bit, we're going to narrow to Corvallis. In prior forums we've had with you, you've said there's been an uptake in racially motivated incidents since 2016, and I think that's locally. So could you talk about what's happening in local schools with policing and the wider Corvallis community?
Well, that's a very layered question, a big question now, right? I think we met a couple of months ago, sometime in the beginning of the year, I think it was. And so you would ask me that question, and I felt like I had to convince the audience that racism was alive and well in Corvallis, that racism was alive and well in this country. And so now you ask me that same question with the recent murders, and not just the murders, but seeing people, on the phone calling the police on a Black person for being, just in a park, or just incidences like that. And so you asked me that question. It's just really, it's really difficult to answer, in the fact that we've seen it with our own eyes now, right? So I don't have to convince you that racism is happening not just in our city, but in our schools. And so I don't really have an answer to that, because it's already been, I don't have to convince you, right, anymore that this is happening. It's now, what are we going to do about it is the question, and not necessarily what am I going to do about it, what are we going to do about it, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And to give another question, because that was my last question for you,
Yeah.
along those lines, what do you think, or do you have recommendations for how to move forward as a community, or do you have any other concerns at the present moment that you want to share?
Yeah, I have a lot of concerns. I think what I would leave on is I think in the recent murder, especially of George Floyd, also the murder, of Ahmaud Arbery, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and others that we don't even know. The recent hangings. There have been 5 hangings found across the country. One that happened in Portland last year, so that would have been a total of 6. So I think with the recent events, I see a lot of movement of people, meaning people want to do stuff, right? I see a lot of movement, and sometimes I just want to say, can we stop, and can we just stop for a moment, right? Because when things like this happen, there is a moment that we are grieving. We are grieving. If we think back to 9/11, what did we have to do after 9/11? We were grieving as a nation, right? And so much of these protests and these rallies are people grieving, right? And so when I say stop, I'm not saying stop those things. I'm saying we need to stop and say, what are we doing? Are we just doing activity? Are we just moving around? Are we just making more work? Or is there a goal in mind? What's our plan, right? And again, we are grieving. These things are not just something we ignore. These are painful incidences that have been happening for over 400 years. And so I say stop, because again, the sky has been falling for 400 years. And the Great Awakening is happening, but we also need to come together during this Great Awakening so that we can be productive and not just running all over the place, because we're going to burn out. So I think I'm saying to all of us, I want to make sure, because this is not a sprint at all. This is many, many marathons. We keep saying that, many marathons that we get to make changes. And I want all of us to do that together. I don't want us to fall because we're tired from all the running around and activity, right? So we're grieving. We get to grieve together as a nation, but we get to move forward as well as a nation. And so that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you. I really
You're
appreciate
welcome. Thank
you. Okay, I'm going to move to Corvallis Police Chief John Sassaman. John, thanks for being here. What is the first question? What is CPD doing to address implicit bias and systemic racism generally? And what measures are in place to protect our Black neighbors, our neighbors of color, from incidents of hate or outright brutality?
Okay, might have to break that down for me for some of those. So let's talk about bias. Part of our CALIA standard, so we're internationally accredited through CALIA, which is the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. And one of its requirements is that we annually train all of our staff on their own bias. We can talk about diversity, we can talk about inclusion, but many of the trainings that we have done over the years touch on explicit bias, internal bias, implicit bias. We've done white privilege. We've talked about power structures, and a lot of what Angel was talking about is very true, in that we have to self-examine ourselves as individuals. So we've been doing that work, and we require it annually. It was a number of years ago that actually we partnered with the NAACP, and we pulled together some workshops, and its focus was on community consciousness in policing. And we sat together and we had hard conversations with one another to learn somewhat about ourselves and about the other, to come together. So those trainings are occurring on an annual basis. I also think that there is a conversation here that needs to occur at the state level, because not all police departments train the same way or adhere to the same standards. And we can have one agency who does something and another who does not and hasn't touched this topic for years. I really believe that the accredited standard is vital, and I believe that every agency across the entire state should have a requirement embedded within itself to make sure that these trainings are occurring. I know there were multiple facets to that question, so remind me.
Okay. I think you pretty much addressed everything, and I know that there are follow-up questions from the audience that we're going to dig into that one a little more. But so as a follow-up, and this kind of links to what you're saying, how, in your view, how does the CPD compare to other departments in the state or in the country that you know of?
Boy, you're wanting me to compare ourselves to everybody else. I'm going to say that I like to think that we are doing what we can do, but I think there's always room for improvement. I will tell you that across the nation, policing is not identical. It is different. There's different federal circuits. There's different laws. There's different, every state has uniquenesses to them. But I would say, and I'm going to go back to having the accredited standards, I think those are important. Right now, they're only voluntary. Police departments don't have to do them. We have voluntarily subscribed to the CALEA standard for many, many years, and we're going to continue to do that. But there's a lot of agencies who don't. And the standards, when we have an on-site inspection, there's people who come in from, they're independent from us. I don't know who they are until they show up. There has to be a fear of failure involved, meaning when the accreditation team shows up, they just don't come and correct you. There is a penalty if you're not doing things right. And I think that's important. And I think more agencies across the country should be adhering to some form of an accredited standard.
Thank you. How has the CPD been involved in community movements in support of Black Lives Matter since the murder of George Floyd? Or what has been the general response from the department?
Well, goodness, Angel and I were talking about this after it happened. And the shock that goes through our organization when we see moments like that, it is absolutely dumbfounding. I was in briefings immediately afterwards and talking to our staff, and there's this moment of how can that be happening that occurs? And then we do a self-examination, and we say to ourselves, how do we make sure that we don't fall into those traps? How do we make sure that we don't go that direction? What are we doing as an agency? So we do those internal exams. But I will tell you that we have the same level of disgust and shock when we see moments like what just occurred in Minneapolis occur. That just is inappropriate. It's a killing. It should never take place with policing in today's day and age. We're in the 21st century. That should never occur.
Thank you. And one last question. Some in our community are calling for defunding the police. Do you have any view on these calls?
I got all kinds of views on that. I think we've already heard that we need to self-examine ourselves individually as people so we understand what our own biases are, what our own prejudices are. And I think when it comes to policing and the whole conversation of defunding, creating greater forms of separation is counterintuitive. What we need to be doing is creating the relationship. Community policing is not a program. It has to be something that's embedded into the fiber of a police department. And the relational work is very important. We need to be connecting our staff when they have unobligated time to be out in positive forward movements with our community and connecting and learning themselves, and also learning other people in the community, learning about what policing is in Corvallis. We think that a lot of times people watch news and they figure out that, well, that's what we are because something happened somewhere else. We like to think that we're different than that. And we need to connect with our community at a local level in a more enhanced way, in a more productive way. And that doesn't mean less. That actually means we've got to have the resources to do the community policing work and have those conversations and dialogues.
Thanks. Thanks again. And I'm going to move to Randy Blazak now, who again is a professor on hate crimes and gender studies. And Randy,
Yes.
of our panels before, can you briefly describe your work and expertise in hate crimes and neo-Nazism?
Well, how much time have you got? I mean, I've been doing this work as a sociologist for over 30 years now, and it started off in the late 80s, understanding or trying to understand the racist skinhead subculture that was causing problems really on a global level, but especially in the Northwest, especially in Portland, Oregon, where an Ethiopian immigrant was murdered by 3 skinheads in 1988. And since moving to Portland in the mid 90s, I sort of moved to the Northwest because this is a hot spot for a lot of reasons that are very historic for white supremacist activity. A lot of people don't sort of recognize the white supremacist history of Oregon, that was founded in 1859 as a white-only state. And that's not even the origin of white supremacy in Oregon. It goes back before that. I was having a conversation with a Native American elder in Warm Springs, and he said, "Randy, do you know when it started getting bad for Native people here in the Northwest?" And I was expecting, some elaborate theory, and he said, "Lewis and Clark." That there is sort of this long history of the displacement of people. And so my work has been trying to understand why people, it started as trying to understand why people join these movements and become involved in white supremacy. I grew up in a Klan town in Georgia called Stone Mountain, where that was quite normal. But since doing that work and writing about that work and talking about the work, my work now is focused on the impact on victims of hate and understanding the trauma that is incurred, not only from a single hate incident or hate crime, but the collective pressure of oppression that comes from centuries of marginalizing people, whether it's people with disabilities or people because of their Black skin or people, whatever the reason is. There's this intense marginalization that creates cumulative trauma that helps us understand what's happening in the streets of America right now. It's not George Floyd, it's all the George Floyds that continue to happen, including after Mr. Floyd was murdered. And so my work has taken sort of an interesting path. I took a little detour doing prison work for a while and understanding those groups, but really trying to now focus on the people who are impacted by the hate and finding ways to undo that. So the main hat that I wear is the chair of the Oregon Coalition Against Hate Crime, which is a statewide coalition that tries to link law enforcement and community groups and government agencies together to find the solution to reduce the hate in our community.
Thank you.
That's my whole life story, just a few minutes.
Great. So from a sociological standpoint, or in your own personal view, is our society finally at a point where real change could happen?
Well, I took a look at the New York Times bestseller list today, and number one on that list was White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo's very important book about how hard it is for white people to talk about racism. And the next 4 books were all dealing with issues of racism. So, if you were using that as a barometer, you could say we're definitely having a moment. I think the George Floyd killing was so clear. There was no ambiguity that maybe he had a gun or he was fighting back or something like that. I mean, just hearing him cry for his dead mother. And there was a study that was done in the late 1960s by a professor at Columbia University who was trying to understand why the 60s were becoming the 60s and why so many of his students were engaged in pretty radical street protests as they were in 1968. And what he found was when people were aware of their values, when they were clear about what they cared about, like fairness and equality, and they were confronted with the reality about how reality and their values are out of whack. People who were turning on the TV in the 60s and seeing Selma, Alabama, and people being beaten by police, it activated them. You care about these things, and you're seeing that they aren't being played out in the society that you celebrate. You're obligated to do something. And I think the George Floyd killing had kind of a similar impact on white people. We care about freedom, and as Angel was saying, you didn't have to convince anybody after that. You saw the reality of police brutality, and it really sort of activated a lot of people. And it's been very encouraging to see that conversation where we don't have to kind of talk about convince people, here's the statistics that prove that racism is endemic in our society. The question is now, what are we going to do about it? Enough of fixing things here and there, and police should have body cameras and all these little things we did after Ferguson and after LA and after Detroit. When we go back and we kind of fix the system a little bit, now we're having a real conversation about the structural presence of white supremacist thinking in our system and how do we change that. I had a conversation with my mother this morning who wanted to know why they were tearing down the statue of George Washington in Portland, Oregon. And I said, well, George Washington did a lot of great things, but he was also a slave owner. So he's freeing a nation while enslaving other people. We need to have that conversation. We can't move forward until we have that conversation, acknowledge that that problem is still with us in the present day. So it's very encouraging. We'll see how it goes. I feel like this it's just sort of this perfect storm, because the lockdown that kind of kept people at home and economically fragile, but in front of their computers, a president who's sending out a very divisive message that's not sort of one side versus the other. And then this particular incident happens, really brought a lot of people out to challenge the system. So I'll just say it's a good time to be a sociologist.
Absolutely. And one last question along those lines. For white people that struggle to claim or even recognize their own legacies of oppression, what do you see within the realm of possibility as far as reaching or educating these people?
Yeah, this is such an important question. Thanks for asking it, Stevie, because we create a sort of a binary of us versus them, us good woke people. And liberals are especially, white liberals are especially good at this. Those bad racist people over there with their Nazi flags and their white hoods, and then us good people who, sing Kumbaya and have Beyonce records and things like that. We're okay. But in fact, what this moment is we're reflecting on ourselves. We're reflecting, and I think Anne talked about it in her art expression, that we reflect on our own racism that is internalized. It's not those bad racists and us good people. It's just us people. And so there's an opportunity now, not just sort of work on the systemic elements, right? We got to figure out how the law works and how our places of business work and how our educational institutions, but also how we work and how we've internalized these things. And that those of us who are very engaged in anti-racism still carry with us racism. And so I think there's an opportunity here for that reflection. When that conversation happens, you start to get real change. And especially, I'll just say one last thing here, is it's really important for white people to stop talking, which is I'm about to do in a second, and listen to the experiences, the real experiences of people of color and their struggle. Because I think if white people just stopped and listened and didn't try to say, well, that's okay, I voted for Obama, or it's okay, I marched in the 60s, or it's okay, I have Black friends. If they just listened to the pain that people are experiencing in 2020, I think their hearts would be moved and they would feel compelled to act.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that. And last, we're going to move to Faye Stetz-Waters, Oregon's Director of Civil Rights. Faye, thank you so much for being here. As a bit of background, you spent 14 years as a police dispatcher back east and shared some thoughts with the police there, which ultimately led you to obtaining a law degree and becoming circuit court judge for Linn County before moving into your present role. Is that correct?
That's correct, Stevie. It's been a long journey. I like to say I cut my teeth in the Marine Corps, and then I got a taste for the paramilitary organizations, which led me to work in law enforcement for 14 years, and kind of sitting back in a civilian role, being the voice, and I consider myself the protector, and kind of looking out for where my personnel were. I got to be in a kind of a unique situation. I got to see people who had taken an oath to sworn and protect. I got to see them as human beings and ask them really difficult questions about how they were treating people on the road, and asking them, is this the best use of your time and resources? And learned quite a bit. I got a reputation for being one who asked difficult questions, such that my chiefs, asked me, "Hey, you are always challenging authority. Have you ever thought about going to law school?" And I got that piqued my interest. But to be able to see police officers who have gun and a badge and have justification to take someone's life when the circumstances dictate, to see them feeling powerless, it was a rare thing. I don't think that most people got to see that these were human beings trying to do the best job that they could with what they had. And what they had sometimes was racist policies. We had a policy that said, you stop a car that's 10 years old or older. And I said to my chief, I said, that's, on the surface, that doesn't seem to be racially discriminatory, but in effect, it is. This is before I went to law school. I could tell that who you were ensnaring was likely to be poor people, people of color, and people who you didn't have justification otherwise to stop. And, he didn't believe me. He said, you're just making noise. And so I did a little study. I asked the police officers, I asked the ones who are 20-year veterans, how do you feel about this unofficial, unwritten policy? And they said they hated it. They worked around it. If a person they were on their way to work, they didn't need their car towed, they didn't need a ticket, they didn't need some other burden that the system would give them that would then take away from their livelihood. So they would just pull their cars off into a parking lot and then give them a ride wherever they need to go. So the senior veteran officers didn't like the policy and found a way around it, but the new guys, they didn't like it either. But they felt they had to comply if this was a matrix that was being measured. How many cars did you stop? How many tickets did you write? How many speeders did you catch? Was the path to promotion, instead of how many people did you help today? How many people did you notice? How many conversations did you have? Did you observe what was going on in your community? And so the young officers said, they didn't like it either. They felt like racist and they felt like they were picking on people. So I took this information back to my chief. I said, nobody's happy about the policy. You might want to think about changing it. So, but it's those kinds of things. We don't see the humanity in law enforcement officers, on little things. When the big things happen, we really don't. We paint them all with one brush. And, I think like Randy said, and like Angel said, and like Chief Sassaman said, seeing this killing in real time, in broad daylight, there's no mistake, no question, violence happened. And it happened, without any humanity, without anyone's intervening. A lot of the 8 count wait, that doctrine has those are some good points that people are making, and we've been talking about those for decades. So someone who's worked inside and outside, I think there's a lot of room for improvement. But this is just one phase of my career. So, but I bring that lens to the work that I do. I think, once you've seen it and you've seen injustice and you've not been able to tell your story or get a fair shake, which leads to, just mass incarceration, just generations of broken families. And then you want to turn around and blame, people of color for these circumstances, and without ever acknowledging that the system is unfair. I'm going to stop talking right there because you look like you probably have another question.
Actually, you already got there for me. I was going to ask you to kind of describe more of what you do now for Oregon's Attorney General.
Sure, great question. I work as the Director of Civil Rights for the Oregon Attorney General and the Department of Justice. So I advise the Attorney General on a wide array of legal matters that involve people's civil rights. One of the things that people often call or write my organization about is, can you do something about the police? The Department of Justice must have supervision over the police departments. Do something about Portland police. And so it's not a day goes by I don't get a letter, a phone call, an email, from someone requesting us to do something about what people are experiencing. And one of the things that I have to tell them is that we don't actually have a superstructure over all of law enforcement. We have a pretty limited role. And people need to be thinking carefully about who is at the table when they're trying to make these decisions about how do we move forward. I think we have to have our reckoning. We have to come to the table and accept that we have put ourselves in a situation. We have given ourselves chance after chance, opportunity after opportunity to respond. And what you hear on the streets is an outcry of reckoning. Some people's reckoning will be quiet. Some people's reckoning will be private, but we all have to have our reckoning of what has brought us to this day. It is about failed practices. It is about a history of white supremacy, of people not wanting to acknowledge it, all of the things that in Robin DiAngelo's book. I'm glad that people are reading and getting informed. I live it every day in this skin, every day of my life for the past 53 years, someone judging me and for the color of my skin and not for who I am as a person or the things that I've done. So I bring that lens to the Oregon Department of Justice. And I also run our bias hotline. Our bias hotline is a statewide hotline. We just launched a toolkit for law enforcement to use when they are interacting with victims of bias, crimes, and bias incidents. These are tools for law enforcement to use and referral cards to give to victims. It has our URL on it. It has our hotline number on it, and it has a lot of reasons about why it's important to report this information to us. We've never collected hate crimes data statewide. We don't know the extent of the problem. We don't know what types of behaviors people are engaging in, and we don't know exactly where it's happening and who's doing it. And so this is an opportunity for us to collect this data. It's also an opportunity for us to reach out and talk to victims and support victims. Yes, we have free speech, and you can say whatever nasty thing you want to say to people. That doesn't preclude us from being there to support people who have had to hear, witness, and be a part of, that hate. So that we're working on the victim side to support victims statewide, to connect them with local resources in their community to help them get past this. We know that how law enforcement responds to a bias victim or any crime victim in the immediate aftermath of that crime will have an effect on how well they overcome it, how well their health and well-being is sustained, how fast it is sustained or improved. So their response matters. We have some suggested language on our website on how, if you're not familiar with hate crimes or working with a victim of bias, we have some language and some suggested words that you can use to help be supportive in those situations. So education, training, retraining is key to how to help move us in a new direction.
Awesome. And that actually segues to my next question. What other improvements do you see are needed as far as policing or criminal justice in Oregon? And how can we as community members or Oregonians get involved?
I think there's a lot of ways for people to get involved. I think we have to recruit differently. We have to recruit for difference. We have recruited from, people who have military background, and I was a Marine, and even though I was in the Marine Corps, I don't necessarily know that picking all of your law enforcement personnel from the military is necessarily a good thing. I think having people who have been able to demonstrate that they have history, experience working in the community, in a community service work that's not, that works across races and cross cultures, so that they have that understanding as a foundation before they even apply to be a police officer. You have to show a commitment to your community. You can't be just someone who fell off I got my degree in the criminal justice program and I want a job as a cop. I think you have to show more of who you are, what you're committed to, and your history hitherto should show and demonstrate what you've been doing with your time. I also think changing how police are structured. So much of entry-level work is considered patrol work. Patrol work is considered entry-level work, but I think that's actually where the people skill is. I think that the person who's on that front line working with people has to have more skill, has to have a better record. Yes, they're likely to come in conflict and in controversy with other people because they're out there more. But if it's been resolved, if people were heard, it takes more time to do it this way, rather than reaching for your weapon, rather than using coercive language, rather than using violent language to force people to do stuff. When I think about the state police trooper who had that bicyclist, pinned to the ground because she wouldn't give her name, there was another way that he could have taken that. He could have said, I have all the time in the world. I care about you as though you were my daughter. And I'm going to take the time that I need with you until you give me what I need, because I need it for this law. And so we'll sit here as long as you need. If you need to contact somebody to help you feel supported while we wait, let's do that. But you can't go. rather than using force and to overwhelm and overcome people. So I just think, if we look at our caretaking function and our helping function a little bit more, and the forcefulness and the violence, and the coercive factor, I think that we have to have less of that. People don't respond well to being yelled at. I know I don't. So I think those are some things that could help move us in a different direction. Reckoning, reconciliation.
Absolutely. Thank you again so much. I'm going to move over to John Haroldson, and then we'll move to audience questions after that. Again, John Haroldson the Benton County District Attorney. John, you've also been on a lot of panels with us before. Thanks for being here. And as the first Latino in Oregon to become a district attorney, what's the journey been like for you as a prosecutor, and what is your sense of the present moment? Oh, you're muted, John.
Thank you for letting me know I was muted. I would be remiss if I didn't begin my comments by saying unequivocally that Black Lives Matter. Now, I say that unequivocally because history has shown us facts that are not political. They're facts that are real. And it shouldn't be so difficult for us to acknowledge those facts and then to acknowledge that there is a disparity that is contributed to through a number of means, but perhaps most significantly by all of the systems that are permeated by racism that we inherited, and perhaps even with good intention, continue to perpetuate, thinking that they're okay. In some cases, that we find ourselves conditioned to believe that. And surely we're told that perhaps in different ways, and whether it's how it's portrayed on television or different aspects of our life experiences. But I would circle back on that piece to the question that you asked, and that is my own journey as a Latino, because it did shape my own perspective in terms of choosing to become a prosecutor. I'm a person who, as a little boy, lived in Monterrey, Nuevo León, in the inner city, in an area of low poverty, or a high poverty, I should say, low income. In any event, the experience of learning about the world in Mexico, as others may refer to, was a rich perspective for me, but different than the perspective that I would have had I not had that experience. Then when I was in the United States, growing up in the 60s and 70s, to observe the injustices that my family, those closest to me, suffered, could have pushed me to a place where I was angry and reactive and wanted some sort of retribution. But interestingly, when I finished law school, first in my family to do so, and became an attorney, first in my family ever to do so, I had that opportunity to become a prosecuting attorney. And I remember one of the first cases I tried was a case that involved a hate crime element. And in that particular case, I remember coming out of that thinking to myself, this really resonates with me, this fight for justice. And that's really when I began to see that my heart was really drawn to fighting for justice, because as it turned out, it was something that I had really been advocating for my whole life, social justice. I did know going in that the criminal justice system had issues, and that my role was to do everything I could to improve it. Today, it's improved a lot, but it still has issues. And it's my role to do everything I can, as long as I can, to make it better. And I'm proud to be joined by the panelists here, most of whom I know well, are individuals who have dedicated themselves with the same passion, and we have worked together, to try to get to that place where we continue to make our systems better.
Thank you. Thank you all again. So speaking of, I guess, how Corvallis compares to other areas as far as policing, criminal justice, what do you see that's happening here comparative to other places in Oregon or the country?
Well, Corvallis is fortunate because, one, we have a humble police chief who didn't come out tonight and say that the CALEA standard is the gold standard in the country. He didn't come out here and say that among collecting data regarding stops and arrests of Black people driving or who are present in Corvallis, that they ranked in the top 3 of the police agencies in the nation in gathering that data. Gathering data that would tell us that the majority of people, or the majority of stops and arrests of Black individuals in Corvallis, the majority of that was initiated by the public. And how important that is for us to understand that in as much as we may feel like reacting towards the police, that there are also aspects of our community that are inextricably connected to what the police are doing. In other words, that the police can be a microcosm, a reflection of the community that has empowered the police. And so those are important things to think about, but they are distinguishing. Now, in as much as I believe that the Corvallis police sets a high standard, that is not to take away from the deeply concerning issues that we are witnessing across this country. The conduct that is just absolutely inexcusable and must stop. And I do believe that the public is appropriately reacting, expressing that desire to see it stop and to trying to find the way to make that happen. And that's why it's important for us to begin to have these conversations, to identify where we have best practices that are working and recognize them as positive models, and to find those that are really struggling so that we can create change that is meaningful change and not symbolic change, but create change that can serve us. And furthermore, I think that as we find those models and we apply those across the board into all of our systems, only then will we begin to have an opportunity to address the true underlying issue. And that is the fact that the foundation of the country was created on a block that was infused with the racism of those ancestors who created it. And now that we are navigating how to be able to take that foundation and get to a place where we have true equity, true inclusion, that we are valuing lives as they should truly be valued. And what's the end result of that? The end result of that is that we would have an incredibly beautiful society. That's really, for me, the greatest challenge of all is this idea that somehow by being inclusive, that will harm our society. That is the supremacist sort of argument, if you will. And yet we see time and time again that inclusivity and true equity promotes strength and excellence. And I would go back to the Corvallis Police Department. When you ask who is the most diverse police department in our jurisdiction, it would be the Corvallis Police Department. Now, the Corvallis Police Department is the most diverse, also has these highest standards. So what does that tell us in terms of where we're going? What does that tell us in terms of the excellence we can achieve? That was probably a broader response, and I went longer than my 2 minutes. I apologize for that, but these are things that I feel very strongly about.
No worries. I'm there with you. And one last question for you before audience questions. Do you have any resources for our viewers that would be useful in getting involved in these issues?
Absolutely. First, there was an article that came out in the Minneapolis Star Tribune regarding the police standards in the in Oregon by DPSST, it's the Department of Public Safety Standards, that all people who want to work in police in Oregon must get certified through them. That in that story, it was 2017, the recommendation was made that Minnesota adopt Oregon's standards, and in essence, of reviewing police conduct. That in that particular year, that the story came out that 3 police officers from Minnesota had been decertified, compared to Oregon decertifying 35. Oregon decertified more police officers than the entire state of California. Now, it's not just about numbers, but it's an important place to be informed in terms of what systems exist. So we feel that desire to get involved and to get informed, to reach out to each governing agency for all of the systems that we're talking about, because it doesn't just stop with law enforcement. It's like, what's the governing agency? What are the governing agencies for schools? Ultimately, it would be the governor of the state of Oregon. And what about for health systems? Okay, what are, and we've got city councils, we've got legislatures, we've got governors, we've got boards of corporations and so forth, to be able to identify those so that we can go to the power structures to make the demands and to promote change through those who are in a position to make it happen through their decisions.
Thanks, John. And I'm going to turn it over to Steve now for our audience questions.
Thank you, Stevie. So, there's been a number of questions about policing. Some of them I'm going to ask whole panel to weigh in on. Some of them I'll direct exclusively to Chief Sassaman or to District Attorney Haroldson. But, I want to start back with the exhibit. Anne, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself if you would, because the first question I'm going to direct towards you.
Hi. Yes.
Hi. So questioner is curious, and it's a good question. It was not one I had anticipated. Has your exhibit been shown elsewhere other than Corvallis, and has anybody responded with anger or has anybody responded with anger?
It's been exhibited in 4 other places, a couple schools and a couple art centers. And no, I have not gotten any, well, they may have responded, but I didn't know about it.
You didn't have to hear it?
Well, when I had an article written in the Oregonian, there were some trolls, but I didn't pay attention to that.
Right.
I expect more anger than I'm actually getting. And my thought about that is that because I'm doing it myself. I am claiming my own history, and I'm not telling anybody what to do. And so I think that as an art project that has a power of personal expression and self-responsibility that can't be denied. So that's my thought about it.
Thank you, Anne. And Randy, I'm going to want to follow up with you a little bit, that you've probably seen this kind of work either as an art exhibit or an editorial or what have you, in terms of white members of society looking to look at their own legacy of oppression, or even trying to find their own implicit bias and confront themselves over their own potential implicit biases, and doing that in some public way, and the way it can be responded to. What have you noticed any kind of trend in the way the public responds to that?
Well, this is sort of and thanks for the question. This is the theme of white fragility and the notion of how defensive we get when a mirror is held up to us, and how complicit we are, whether it's through our silence or through our engagement in things that we didn't think about as white supremacists. I just had a moment at Fred Meyer today on the syrup aisle, looking at the Aunt Jemima bottle of syrup and thinking, the history of this Aunt Jemima syrup that I've grown up with is woven into a slave narrative. And why have I not thought maybe they should do something about this syrup and Uncle Ben's while we're at it. And so I think there is this immediate defensiveness that people want, again, to get into this binary of us versus them. And it's very hard. It's very hard. And when I talk about doing this work, there's so much work to be done. And I really am grateful for everybody on this panel because they're all part of this process. I think about it sort of on the three levels that we do the work. One is the institutional level, by which we change the laws. Not only do we need to scrap Jim Crow, we need to think about things like policies in policing and education and all the places that we find racism endemic, and hiring practices and things like that. We work on a cultural level, how we spend our Saturday night. Who is in our bubble? How many people do we know on a personal level that have different demographics than us? But then the third level is on the personal level, which includes how do we interrupt it when we hear it. And that includes sexism and homophobia and all the other biases that are out there, not just racism. But how do we reflect on it when it comes up in us? And it is very easy for people to kind of get defensive. And so there is one of the things that's been very powerful in the last couple of weeks since the George Floyd murder is seeing on the news African-American men in tears talking about what seeing that murder, and we're going to call it a murder, what seeing that murder meant to them as Black men in society, and how African-American men maybe especially, are supposed to put up this wall of non-emotion, are challenged to be emotional. And so, we're in a moment of reflection, and maybe the pandemic has given us a little time out where we're allowed to be a little bit more reflective. But there is this natural defensiveness around these things that the trolls, as Anne said, will come out. They get so defensive, they get so racist and misogynistic, and they want to wave that Confederate battle flag, and they want to prove that they're not disappearing. And so this ties, and let me just sort of wrap up this comment. This ties into something that's been a theme in my research, which is the notion of white entitlement. That if you're white, this is your country, you're underlined, and therefore all these challenges that are coming at you as a straight, white, able-bodied, cisgendered male are challenged to something that belongs to you, that she took away my job. She took my job. It wasn't your job, But there's this notion of entitlement that puts people in a very defensive position. And so there's an opportunity here to kind of address that emotional response, the emotional response of, hey, you're taking this away. I was talking to my father on Father's Day, and he was quite upset about, statues being torn down and erasing history. And I said, Dad, there's this thing called books. History, it lives in books. You can tear down all the statues you want, but there's still going to be history books. Maybe we should. And he said, well, that's next. The next will take away the books. I'm like, that's not, there's this sort of defensive knee-jerk reaction that we really have to pay attention to. And so I think at the moment, there is this response to pay attention to what that is. What is that need to be in a defensive framework to say, you're taking this away from me?
And I'll give you the real quick follow-up to that, just 15 seconds, sorry. You talk about kind of getting over that bubble, or getting through that bubble a lot of people find themselves in, of hanging around only with their demography. What are some quick things that people can do to remedy that a bit?
Be quiet. Be quiet and listen. That's what I would say. I would be quiet and listen with your heart to the experience of other people. I think that is the first and most important step.
Right. Okay. And then, Angela, I'm going to move to you for a moment, as you see people that are trying to work through, you're seeing people that want to work through this. And what are some tips, hints? And then I've got another questioner that has asked you something else, but I was just wondering if you have any response to anything Randy or Anne said, really, in essence.
So just to clarify, when you say working through this, can you be more specific?
So working in terms of claiming their own legacy, and questioning their own biases, and that they will sometimes, do that in a public way. Anne has done that with her art, or they'll write an editorial, or they'll write a book. And then, yes, the trolls do come out. Yes.
Definitely.
Right. And so, you know, you've witnessed this, yes? You know, I'll change the question because I don't think you're relating to it. As you go through your work, are you
Yes.
also encountering anger, defensiveness?
Yes, definitely. I think that's why it's so important, as Randy said, to listen, not just listen to people, but listen to Black and Brown people. And you know, when people say, Angel, what can I do? And I tell them, to come to a meeting and listen and not talk, and to center Black voices. Some of them have a really hard time, because when you have white privilege, you get to walk into a room and immediately you are the leader of said room, right? And so for me to ask Stevie to come to our meeting so that you can learn, first of all, you're appalled because I've just told you you have something to learn, right? And your whole life you've been told, you know, as a white person, you know all these things. You don't need, you know, you don't need to listen to this Black woman, right? And so listening is so important, because how do I know what I need to do if I'm not going to talk to the person who needs it done for them, right? So for instance, Stephen, how do I know what you need unless I ask you? And not just ask you what you need, but I need to listen so I can go and do that thing that you need. Because if I don't, it's that whole the whole thing about there's a phrase they say, don't do it for us without us. Have you heard that before? Meaning, if I plan a Black Lives rally, right, and I'm not talking to Black folks, how do you know what Black lives need? Does that make sense? So this whole idea of listening is so important, or we're just going to continue with this privilege of thinking Randy can think, I already know what Angel needs, right? And so Randy will continue to speak for me, and he will continue to perpetuate this white privilege, this white supremacy, versus just, I need you to listen now. And it's okay, because there are things that you can learn. And the fact that you recognize that is a huge breakthrough, So when you come to, let's say the NAACP meeting, when you go to an Urban League, when you go to Casa Latinos, where Black and Brown voices are centered, you actually get to learn. When you ask me, what do I do? I get to tell you that, and you get to go, oh, that's what you need, right? So you're not doing it because you think you know what's right. You're doing it because you're like, oh, now I see. So I want to echo that from Randy. Just listening is so important, especially in these times, because there's a lot of voices, you guys. There's a lot of voices going on right now, and we need to be careful who we are listening to.
And now, do any of our other panelists have anything to add to that, or shall I move to the next question? Which again is actually, in fact, for Angel.
I just want to say that, you know, the learning is everyone learns. You know, my 53 years on the planet, I just learned yesterday, my brother sent me this article, Inward loves a watermelon, ha, ha, ha. And you may not recognize the lyrics, but if you recognize the vehicle that goes down the street, your street, selling ice creams, you know, to your little kids, that's the jingle. That's how much racism is ingrained and a part of our culture and our summers and our holidays and our school year, and we're unaware. And so this time period is for listening and learning and for becoming aware. I once had a supervisor tell me, you know, a queer Black woman that as I came out to him, that was 3 strikes against me. I was Black, I was a woman, and I was gay, that I should keep the last part to myself. You know, for him, you know, my life was a huge risk. You know, it was going to amount to nothing, you know, and was hopeless. And our lives are not hopeless. We have so much talent to give and to share if you would only get out of the way and let us do our work.
Thank you, Faye. And then I'm going to go ahead and Angel, I'm going to circle back to you in a couple of minutes. I want to get to these compiling policing questions a little bit. So John Sassaman and John Haroldson, I'm going to be kind of getting you a series of questions, so kind of be prepared for that. And some of these are a little bit loaded, and feel free to challenge the context where you feel that you ought. But I'm going to read them raw to some extent. And Chief Sassaman, I'll go to you first. Why does the police resort first line of defense to arresting people instead of alternative therapeutic community or socially conscious responses? I don't know if that's, one, necessarily true in all cases, and two, obviously not all calls lend themselves to that. But let you answer.
Yeah, I understand how that question's loaded, and with the assumptions that are in there. When we don't always know, we make assumptions, and those are what's dangerous. I would tell you that what we train our staff to do is contextualize the best they can the events that they have to respond to, and seek to problem solve to achieve the best outcome possible for everybody involved. I can tell you statistically, 40 to 45% of our cases are cited and they're not taken into custody. That just doesn't happen. So when a police officer responds, they have to balance the events that they're faced with along with the victim, and how do we serve that person? So they're having to balance this teeter-totter. And it's a difficult task. But I will tell you that in terms of how we want our staff approaching cases, is we want them to best contextualize everything. How do we problem solve it and go back to what's the best solution? Sometimes that is merely a conversation and a warning. Sometimes that is a citation. Sometimes taking somebody into custody is the only option. So I would say that we don't always respond with an arrest first. I am going to say that we train our staff to problem solve first. And what is the best outcome?
And then, I think I want to extend that question to some extent to John Haroldson. And I actually want to bring up a specific instance, in fact, John. So I'll ask that you unmute yourself first. And then the question really is this. There are times that even where an officer maybe has arrested, you'll choose not to charge. And I've also seen it, I think there's one particular case where I think I'd come up to you and I said, why didn't you go stronger? And you didn't want to have this particular person's arrest entirely define their life. So you make these decisions on a daily basis. And what does that look like for you, that you sometimes have to make a choice of whether you're going to go through doing the strongest allowable legal remedy or not? And sometimes you choose not to charge. You've talked in previous panels about the considerable power of that decision making.
You bet. Well, the prosecuting attorney, in the purest sense, is someone whose goal is justice, not convictions, but justice. And so to be able to reach that goal and make the decisions to get to that place, you are best served by being highly informed. And the more informed you are, the better the chances are that your decisions will result in a just outcome. When we don't have information, when we don't have full context, then in any system that we're in, we're going to be more prone to making errors because we're frankly uninformed. And so with that in mind, I believe that we need to continue to evolve in all of our systems to ensure that our decision makers are fully informed and are relying upon that information to make each and every one of their decisions. So not just a matter of saying, okay, we're going to be uninformed, but we're going to be nice guys. You know, that's just really some arbitrary favoritism that it could be impulsive and reactive, as opposed to striving towards really a constitutional mandate to treat similarly situated people the same. Okay, but it's not as simple as saying, okay, those two people are wearing hats, therefore they're similarly situated. To really understand how someone is situated is to understand so much about them that you know, it's a lot to consider. It's not an easy job. When we think about our most progressive systems, drug treatment courts, mental health courts, family courts, homeless courts, these are the evolution of our existing justice systems with a design that allows the decision makers, judges, prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the treatment providers, it allows them to make much more highly informed decisions as they are guiding individuals through those progressive processes. Now, there may be different challenges that we have to meet with different methods, and that's always going to be evolving for us. I'd like to think that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, we're going to look back at the way we're doing things today and think that that's pretty archaic. And we'll wonder, why on earth did we do that? Well, that's part of that evolution, just as we may look back 50 years from now and say, I can't believe that we would do that. That is evolution, and we should promote evolution of the justice system. We want to make it better. That means that we continue to put our efforts and our resources into that, using the greatest minds and the greatest information to be able to drive those decisions.
So, and then I'll return to John Sassaman. We have a number of questions that have to do with, okay, what are you doing as a department to kind of root out implicit bias, and to frankly assure that you have officers that do not react in some of the ways that have been so well chronicled that have brought us to this moment in terms of thinking about policing nationally. What goes on in short, what goes on at CPD that makes you different than other departments, if in fact you are?
Yeah. Well, let me start with saying I really loved some of what Faye was talking about in terms of having some of our most competent people working the road, and yet our system is flipped upside down. We take brand new hires and we put them out in those very difficult and challenging moments, and we expect somehow perfection out of them. So I think that's remarkably insightful, so thank you for that. So for Corvallis, what we do is we've changed our modeling when it comes to how we recruit. In days of old, people would go to universities and who wants to do a job fair for law enforcement? It's the wrong place to be. Or law enforcement would just put an advertisement out there and wait and see who applies. It's the wrong place. And I will tell you that those practices still continue today all over the place.
So what do you do that's different?
So we're taking a sort of a different approach. We're looking at educational environments. I want people who are school teachers who have those communication skills and understanding child development, youth development. We're going to high-tech businesses, high-tech somebody who understands sort of the complexities of computers, has a mind for detective work, and they think of things differently. It's a different lens that we bring to the table. We're looking at biologists. I've got scientists. I've got people who were school teachers. I've got people who were nurses. And now that we're trying to draw that difference here, I don't want people who grew up and said, I want to be a cop. There's those who will be in the system, but that's not everybody. So we're looking at a different applicant. Then when we test them, we're not using tests of old. We have shifted all of our written examinations so that we are focusing on emotional intelligence and relational intelligence. What are those things? How do our staff actually understand whom they're engaging in the field? Can they read the facial expressions? Can they understand the stress of those moments? So we're trying to capture that as a testing tool. You know, we also do a very in-depth background investigation. We turn someone's life upside down from birth to moment, and we examine it. This is a very difficult profession to get into today. We look at everything that they have done. We're looking at their world online. We're looking at those little nuggets that might tell us something about them. And then we obviously do a psychological examination, and we use professionals to evaluate our staff.
And is that what's going on at most departments, or?
It wasn't until late that psychological exams were required. And I'm going to say that was within, I think, the last 2 years. Prior to that, agencies weren't required. We've been doing that.
How long has CPD been doing it?
I've been here for 32 years, so 32 years, because I had to take one.
So this has been going on in Corvallis for a while.
For a long time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what are you kind of thinking would be, in the hiring practices are fascinating because we're having the same discussions in journalism. From your standpoint, what are some things that you would hope are the next advances?
Well, right now, we've got to find a way to draw the right people into this profession. And that is one of our greatest challenges. I mean, in light of everything that's going on across this country, and we are getting painted with this broad brush, we're trying to separate ourselves from that. How do we do that so we attract the right folks? And it's difficult right now. We don't have, I mean, we're government. We don't get to hire someone and say, here's a BMW like Intel does or IBM does. I don't get signing bonuses. We're talking about walking into a profession that is, in many respects, a meat grinder. You're asked to be superhuman in every moment, to understand everything perfectly. And we're asking humans to do that. We've got to get, I want to say the word diversity, but what it really is people who have a host of different backgrounds. That's one of the things we talk about when we have a major homicide case. We want difference in the room, looking at the facts. And when you have healthy conflict, healthy debate, you make sure that nothing falls through the cracks. That's important. We've got to make sure that we have those healthy differences applying for police officer positions and then hiring them. You know, I would also submit that if you want to pay somebody $20,000 a year, you're not going to get much. This is a profession, and the expectation of performance is so high. We have got to change that dynamic and turn it into a profession that is well compensated in the right way, because we expect greatness from human beings in a split second, because they're going to make a decision and they are going to get judged by so many different aspects of this system who get to slow down the camera and look frame by frame at everything. So we have to turn it away from a blue collar type of a position and into an absolute profession.
This will dovetail into some of the yes/no questions. I'm gonna reduce some of them to yes and no, so because we can run for time for a bit. But you know, as I'm hearing you talking about what you're hoping for next steps out of the profession, I'm going to turn to Angel Harris for a moment. And I'm going to ask in blunt terms, what are you hoping CPD may be doing next, or are you already kind of looking at what's happening at Corvallis Police Department and going, you know, we're in a good direction, or what next steps would you hope for?
Well, the thing about it is we try to have relationships with the chief, with our department, because we don't want to be reactionary. So the things that we have been working on over however many years it's been as a partnership is so that when things come up, and we hope that they don't come up, right? We hope incidences don't happen in our city, but when they come up, we already have a plan, right? We've already hopefully set things up so that there's less incidences, but also when they happen, they could be dealt with, right, in a real way. And so I say that to say this, CPD is different in ways which I would normally, if I lived in a different city, I can't guarantee that I would actually be able to talk, or that the chief of police would even have a dialogue with me over a phone, right? And so just that component of the relationship. But I know, and I've talked to Chief about this before the George Floyd incident happened, probably a couple of weeks before that happened, we spoke about the relationship with the community. And when I say community, I mean the Black community and actually the brown community as well. And the fear that still permeates Corvallis and the police. And so when I say, what do I want moving forward, what do we want to see, is like I told Chief Sassaman, I want to see us having real dialogue, because just because I know the chief, and some of the officers, just because a couple of us may know the CPD, that does not help our community to get to know what are the things that are going to change in our community, because no one's perfect, right? This community, the CPD is not perfect. There are standards that they have worked on, but there is always room for improvement. But it starts with, how in the world do we get each other in the same virtual room, because we have COVID, so we can't be in the same room, but in the same virtual room, so that when I'm hearing from my community that we are scared of our police, I need the police to respond, and why that is, and the realities of that, but also Chief Sassaman to dialogue, to talk about that, because we don't want our communities to have that fear, right? And where does that fear come from? So there has to be this relationship. When we talk about community policing, we're not just talking about the general community, right? We're talking specifically the relationships between the historical, even relationships between communities of color and the police, which again is we don't even have time, right? We don't even have time right now to even begin the history of that, right? The history of police, and then how that relates to us and the impacts of that today. So you better believe, Steve, that we, as the NAACP, we as a community, we are going to be working together. We've already spoken with John Haroldson as well. Also the WCJC, we have spoken, which is the Willamette Criminal Justice Council. We are talking about how do we make our community better, so that incidences that are happening around our country, because we're in a racist system, is not, right? We're not going to let that happen on our watch here in our area. And hopefully we will be an example for other places in our state, and who knows, in our country. I mean, that's always the goal.
Yeah, and then, I'll move to Faye Stetz-Waters real briefly. Faye, and this is, brief, you see what's going on around the state. You see what's going on with other departments. Heck, you've been at Back East. You've been a judge. You've got experience in this area. When you see what John Sassaman is talking about, what Angel Harris is talking about, John Haroldson is talking about, in terms specifically of Corvallis policing, what is your sense of, well, frankly, where we stack up in terms of operating in a way that will be impartial, fair, just, equitable, and hopefully with the least detrimental result compared to other departments?
Let me say, I feel so much confidence and hope that I live in the Valley. I live in Albany. I don't live in Corvallis, so I'm not as lucky as those who do. and I don't live in Benton County. But I'm hopeful by what I hear. I'm responding to calls from people from jurisdictions where law enforcement won't even come and respond to their hate crime, to their bias complaint, where they've been injured by, members of the 3%ers, and the police won't take their complaints. So, I think that we're very fortunate here in the Valley, where we have law enforcement and the district attorney's office that are working together with the community to build better models. And I think that's what we need. We have a time where we can be creative, and we can start over about what we want in terms of how do we protect the public, maintain public safety, and honor and respect people's rights. I think there's a way that we can do it that's not revolving around people's identity, around people's race, but around people's behavior. And that's what we should be looking at. What is it that you're doing out there that's harming other people? Is that a violation of the law, without regard to who you are? We also need to be thinking about mental health differently. I think we need to be looking at, who are the other people in the community that can help us with this work. Not everybody who has a gun and a badge needs to go to every call. And I think there's a way for the community to be involved in our community safety. And I know we're short on time, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Faye. Chief Sassaman, I'm going to ask a series of just yes or no, or kind of 1 or 2 word questions that I'm conflating some of the questions into singular questions that I think we can move through fairly quickly. Has the department purchased excess military equipment or surplus military equipment?
No, we don't do that. No plans to do that.
Okay. Do new recruits need a college degree?
They minimally have to have, if you look at college degrees, they minimally have to have an associate's.
Okay, and then at the department currently, what would you say percentage of, and I know it's probably going to be a guess, what percentage of folks have a more advanced degree than associate?
We're 71% have a bachelor's minimum, and we have several with a master's.
Okay, and I don't even know what the term is, so forgive my ignorance, and you may not know what it is. I don't know what warrior. So do you support warrior policing training programs? And I don't even know what that is.
I know what that is. No, we don't. I can tell you that we approach policing from a guardianship mindset and a guardianship philosophy.
Thank you. Has any officer been fired for excessive use of force in the past 5 years?
No.
Okay, and what is the police department's policy on body cams? I'll say that first.
We comply with state law. So the officers who have them, when they use them, they turn them on when they're engaged with the suspect in the case.
Great. And chokeholds, are they permitted?
No.
Okay. And then if an officer sees another officer behaving inappropriately, in other departments, they're hesitant to do anything. Does our department have any policy surrounding that circumstance?
If an officer sees somebody or another officer acting outside the scope of law or policy, they're required to intervene.
Okay, great. Pretty direct answers. I appreciate that. Another answer, and this may take just a little longer. I don't know that you'll have the numbers. Another question. And I don't know if this is true. I haven't had time to look. The questioner says the police budget has increased 35% since 2017. One, do you know if that's true or not, or what it has increased since 2017?
Yeah, what they're talking about is the 911 district, and that's our big increase. But that was passed for 911 services, and so that's an 11 new staff for our 911 center. That's the increase they're talking about.
Right, and that's not just policing, though. That's 911. Every emergency. Yeah, okay. It's 911, right. Yeah, and I remember that. Okay, I remember that. Has there been some, and then the rationale for that levy, if I recall, was because we were funding it the same way we were, 30 years ago?
Yeah, for 911. It was a 1983 formula, and it was not sufficient to meet the needs. And the city of Corvallis was essentially subsidizing different portions.
Okay, and it looks to me like that kind of answers this questioners' questions.
Right.
Okay. Number of questions about particular incidents, police personnel, that as a journalist, I don't think I'd ask the specifics as to the names of personnel involved, because frankly, I haven't done the work to find out if any of this is reportable. Things have to meet a certain kind of line or a standard if they're going to be reportable. So I don't want to, in a public forum, give the names of officers. But what processes are in place in these matters so that citizens can get their questions submitted and asked and then answered?
Anybody can email us right here at the police department. They can ask me, they can channel it through the city manager's office if they like. We're more than happy to answer any questions that people might have regarding our operation.
Now, what about a specific incident or a specific officer?
Personnel matters are personnel matters, and then some of those fall under state laws. So in some cases, they're not releasable. In other cases, they may be.
Okay. Then, one of the things, because it has been widely reported and been dealt with to some extent, there's been a lot of questions about the Genesis Hansen incident. So, we'll go through it for a moment. It was state police, state trooper that made that arrest, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. And there was a CPD officer present, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What was your, and I'm going to ask both you and I'm going to ask John Haroldson, what was your view of that circumstance or that incident?
When we have staff who are involved in an event that is in conflict with policy or law, we take swift action. We take corrective measure.
Was there some corrective measure taken in this instance?
Yes.
Okay. Do you care to elaborate further?
Nope. It's
Didn't
personnel.
think so. Yep, got it. John Haroldson, I know charges were filed and you chose not to pursue them. Does that speak for itself, or did you want to elaborate?
I'll elaborate to this point. Charges were not filed, to be clear.
Right.
Following the arrest, I was contacted by the state police expressing concerns from their leadership at Oregon State Police on campus regarding the investigation itself. And so they worked with me on getting the video over to me, and I had an opportunity to review that and issued a very timely opinion that there was no criminal conduct, and the arrest was without criminal basis. Where it becomes complicated is the understanding of what people think the law is versus what the law is, and then how those discussions turn on strong opinions of people judging others based on what they think the law is or what they think the facts were, and they may or may not be accurate. The example that I would offer of that is somebody might have a really strong feeling that you should do what the officer says. Just sort of as a practical matter, if the officer orders you to do something, you're supposed to do that, otherwise you're arrested. And that's not the state of the law in Oregon. And so if somebody believes that's the state of the law, and then they form a whole opinion around it and are critical of the individual who was arrested, that criticism is based on a false premise. I think the matter is compounded by the reality that I think we have to be careful not to miss. And that is that sometimes we can get lost with assumptions and interpretations of facts and miss the underlying issue that exists in our society. There are incidents that can present incredible injustice, degrees of injustice, or trigger a sense of injustice. And in the course of that, it takes us to a place where we evaluate whether or not this is really how we want to be doing, how we want our systems to be working. And to take that back even one step further, because I think this goes back to the whole issue that we've been talking about with respect to having representation that is diverse in our agencies. And it's critical to come back to this point because there's a continuum here. If you have an agency that is not diverse, and that agency is doing their best, but just by virtue of the fact that they lack some insights and perspectives that they don't have, injustices happen. That can be one thing. And then there can be injustice as a result because somebody's a sadist. There can be injustice as a result for a whole number of reasons. But at the end of the day, when you really want the best possible agency, who is helping to make that happen? Because as John said, it's not enough to simply put up a paper that says, hey, sign up here. And I think that Faye Stetz-Waters talked about this too. But how do you create a culture where people of color want to work for that agency? How do you create a culture where people of color want to work in this education system because they believe in it and they believe that it is for all? That is the type of commitment that has to take place. And it requires a whole community to come together because it is not easy in a community that doesn't have a lot of diversity, relatively speaking. And I can speak. And
then let me move, as you bring that up, I actually want to ask Angel a follow-up on it.
So I'll just wrap it up with this last point to say that, in the County District Attorney's Office, 40% of our lawyers are lawyers of color. 30% of our employees are employees of color. It has taken time to be able to get there using similar models like CPD, where we build those relationships over a lengthy period of time. And, I've had the opportunity to work with leaders like Faye Stetz-Waters. I've had the opportunity to work with leaders like Angel Harris and many others in order to build those relationships with communities, to create the environment that people want to be a part of. And can you imagine what our societies would look like today if all of our systems had that dynamic? That's what I believe we should be working towards.
And then, I want to move to more of that conversation actually in a couple of minutes because some questioners have asked some insightful questions, and then we're going to be wrapping up fairly soon. But Angel, the Genesis Hansen arrest or the Genesis Hansen incident, do you have any comment to make on that at this point specific to that incident? Nope. Okay.
I think the Chief and John summed it up very well.
Okay, great. So I want to go ahead and move on. And, I'm going to move away from policing and then back to policing in a couple of minutes. This question, I think, is really aimed at Faye. It's coming through social media. The question is essentially this. So much of our racist systems are held in place by financial structures, how money is gained, spent, so forth. And there's what would an anti-racist financial infrastructure look like locally, nationally? I think you kind of get the idea of what the questioner is after. And Angel, I'm going to go to Faye first. And then John, they're asking, I'm assuming John Haroldson specifically also to answer. So, but I want to go to Faye first.
Thank you, Steve. I think that, we African Americans have had thriving communities, have had rich businesses and a rich culture that have been burned down and destroyed when they became too popular, too successful, and threatening to a larger culture. And so right now, I think, there are plenty of businesses, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, businesses owned by people of color that we can support. So I think down the road, it's about like, where do we spend our money? Are we willing to do the research and make the sacrifice to our convenience, not to participate in a business, not to support a business that gives their money to causes that we don't support? I mean, when we learn that we have economic power, we have learned this recently. When we don't spend money, the economy tanks. You need us to spend money. So how we spend money, where we spend money matters. And so we need to take this power and
Vote with your
decide.
dollars, huh?
Yeah, it's about the dollar, about the Benjamins. I know that's passe to say that, but it is about how and where you spend your money.
Is there something implicit in the financial system? There used to be redlining, right?
Yeah.
Do we still have this implicit bias? You see the whole state at this point. What kind of complaints do you get along those lines? Is this still going on in Oregon?
I'm getting complaints from people of color who are saying, in the midst of COVID, that they, not their white neighbors, are being asked to redo their leases, being forced to pay money because we know you have it, being shaken down for money because people, they think that people are fearful, that they won't report, that there's no system in which they would hear their complaint. And so my office actually stands for one of the few places where people can actually, tell people about this problem. And when you get a call from the Department of Justice and asked to be explaining yourself as to why you're engaging in this, this business practice, people are have a hard time explaining why they're doing it. There are opportunists out there, but I think that we have to be smarter than that. And we have to, you have to follow the trail of money, and where we spend our money and how we spend our money right now and in the future counts, not just one day of the week, not just one day of the year, but consistently. We can help uplift different businesses that have different values, and we can show our values in how we spend our money.
So, Angel, I'm going to move to you, and then I'm going to move to John. Really same question. The implicit bias in our financial system. What does that, Angel, look like to you? And are you seeing also local incidents? Angel, you're still muted.
Can you ask that question again, Steve?
Yeah. So, there's implicit bias. There used to be redlining, for instance. There's still implicit bias that you're seeing in our financial systems. Implicit inequity, inequality. And do you see that locally as well in some of the way that our financial systems operate locally? Do you hear complaints?
Yes. So I think one example, COVID has been a great exposer of, of not just inequity, racism. It has been a great expose, right? So when we think about the PPP loans, and you look at who received PPP loans,
Yeah.
Minority businesses were not the ones receiving those. And that's we're just talking about the state of Oregon. We're not even talking about nationally. So I think when we're talking about these implicit biases, sometimes what I'm finding, Steve, is that it's not only implicit biases, we're talking about explicit biases as well. Because it no longer gets to be implicit when when I tell you, or when it's shown to you what's happening, and you still choose to ignore, right? You still choose to not want to change. So it goes from implicit to now explicit. Like, you are letting me know that you understand, but you're going to keep moving forward no matter what, right? And when we talk about the dollar, the dollar is so important because you have to remember our history. History is so good because it lets us know why we are where we are today. And so when we talk about the Civil War, we have to remember it was the bloodiest war, right? The bloodiest war that we fought on our land. We're not talking about international, we're talking about the bloodiest war on our land. And it was all for that almighty dollar, to keep my ancestors, I'm from Mississippi, by the way, to keep my ancestors making that money. So it was all about that money. And so really quick, when we think about COVID, it comes back to COVID. Who are the frontline workers who don't get to stay at home during COVID? A lot of Black and brown people have to work, right? We don't get to stay in our houses. And so when we talk about the dollar, Dr. King even talked about capitalism and the dollar. And if we choose, and when I say we, I mean all of us, white, Black, purple, whoever, when we choose to, like Faye said, when we choose to say, no, we're not going to spend our money there, it makes a difference, everyone. It really makes a difference. So, yeah.
Okay, and then, the other thing is, and I'm going to go through this kind of lightning quick. We're running out of time. Got about 10 minutes left. That's it. Really, from the standpoint of John Sassaman, Chief Sassaman, I'm going to move to you really quickly and ask you, I know that the department does these trainings. I got so many questions from the public that they don't realize the vetting process that you go through, that you've described tonight, the training that you go through with your staff, the self-examination in the department, all those answers you've given tonight. They don't realize, is the department open to considering better communication or more communication with the public, so they just know what you're doing?
Mm-hmm. We are open to whatever is needed to best communicate that. Really? So we're open to different ideas, different communication platforms, how to best do it, so that it's constructive and positive. So again, if there's a better idea on how to communicate it, we're all ears.
Right. Now, if there is a citizen review structure for the police department, that's another question I've gotten a bunch of, right?
Yeah, we do. We have a citizen review board, and it is made up of community members. They are identified by the mayor, approved by the city council, and we meet quarterly and go over, issues that are occurring and how they're being resolved. And we look for trends. We look for uniquenesses in that, and they keep me in check. They make sure that the right things are happening.
Are those meetings public?
There are portions of them that are public. There's other, when you get into the deep personnel matters, or some of it that are not. But it is a external examination, if you will, and external checks and balances.
Yeah, are you putting out the times for those so people know when the public portions of those are?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they get advertised on the city's webpage.
Okay, great. And then, I just suggest maybe press releases and social media,
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I want to go through really almost lightning round. It's almost not fair, 60 seconds from each of you, if that. The move to police, everybody's talking about police defunding. Depends on who you're talking to, what that means. And then I'll just, I'll start with John Haroldson. About 30 to 60 seconds on that subject.
Right. I can appreciate the reaction. However, the more we discuss what our vision is for the future, the clearer it becomes that society is asking for something better, to build upon perhaps what we have or rebuild. And that requires an investment as opposed to taking money away. I decide what is it we want and what are we willing to pay for it. If we want the police to wear body-worn cameras, I'm assuming we also want somebody to review those body-worn cameras. Are we prepared to pay for that? I would strongly advocate that we do so. It's important for us to be willing to make that commitment. And that's true for every single one of our systems. When we envision what we want those systems to be, we should be proud to make the investment necessary to make the best system that we can possibly afford.
And then I'm going to go to, I'll first go to then Angel Harris, then Faye, please. Angel, I'll go to you. Police defunding around 30 to 60 seconds. Oh, you're on mute, Angel.
I just laughed when you said 30 to 60 seconds because you know me too well. Am I
But
long-winded now?
I know that I know
But
that.
if John Haroldson can do it, I can do it. 30 to 60 seconds.
Yeah. Sorry, John.
That's a lot to say in 30 to 60 seconds. But what I would say is there are duties that our police officers are doing that they shouldn't be doing. I will say that. And so as we examine,
can you be specific?
Yeah. So we can talk about mental health. Right? And as working in the medical industry, when I need help, right, mental health help, I'm not sure why we're calling officers, right, to intervene with someone who's having a mental health crisis, right? I don't think originally that was the plan, to have cops come and de-escalate someone who's having a crisis. I think that's too much to ask. Another thing would be in our schools, and that's a whole debate we can talk about. But my son will be starting high school next year, and so he's never had a fully uniformed officer in his school. Usually when I call, if I need help from John, right, if I need help from the police department, that means that there is a potential bad thing that's going to happen. So when I see them, I appreciate you, but it just means there's a bad thing that's going to happen, right? That's just the nature of your job. Just like as a nurse, when you see me in your room, you know that there's something that Angel's about to do that's probably not going to be as pleasant, right? Because I'm here to take care of you for a reason, right? And so the very nature of the job is to do certain things, right? And then there are counselors, there are social workers, there are people who care and who nurture, and then there are people I need, when there's this bad thing that's going to happen, I need you to come and help us in that. And that's okay.
Okay, and then, but does that necessarily translate to the first call? If somebody's wielding a hatchet, they may need mental health help. But first, probably an officer needs to respond, get the hatchet from them, right? I don't know. I guess I want to have some clarity about what you're saying. Well, who would respond to these calls? How would 911 be able to figure out who to send?
Exactly. That is the question, Steve. Those are the questions that we get to figure out as a community together, because it has not been talked about. It's just like, this is what we're going to do, but is this the best course of action?
Right. Okay, and then I'm going to move to, I'll move next. Faye, did I skip you?
You didn't get to me yet. I'm next.
That's right. So Faye, you're next, and then Anne Mavor, and then Randy, and then John.
So I want to say, as a 911 dispatcher who took calls from Karen before Karen was designated Karen in the 90s, I want to say that, law enforcement has you have somebody on the phone who thinks that you are their personal fixer. And you can ask this person, hey, can you just kind of point me your phone, turn your camera on and point me in the direction of the person who's the Black person usually, who's sitting on the bench watching birds or sitting there minding their own business. You just take a picture of that for me. And this person will yeah, let's take a picture of them. Take a picture. Can you send that to the police department? Yes, yeah. Send it. I'll send it to you. What's your email? You get a picture and you say, you know what? We're not going to perpetuate your racism. When you see something that's violating the law, let me know. We're not coming today, not for this. And the police department can be the leaders on this and stop coming to these kinds of calls. I know the risk analysts are saying, but we got to go to every call. No, you just took a picture and you saw a person sitting on the bench. You got your justification for not responding to that particular caller. And you can ask them to check their racism. But that's a waste of police time and services. We have a swatting law. It doesn't have the teeth that it does have, but it's a start. But I don't think that, adding police to that equation is necessary. And the police can have a role in saying, you know what, we're not coming to that one.
And I laugh because you and I spoke longer than I would normally speak and prep with somebody. And I feel like I know your personality a little bit, and I can imagine you telling somebody, are you kidding? So, Anne, I'm going to move over to you and then Randy. Anne, you're muted. Great, there we go.
Yeah, so I
Police
don't really
defunding.
have anything to say directly about police.
I love it when somebody knows that they don't have and they just admit that. Thank you. Randy, I'll move over to you.
Yeah, real
Then
quickly,
it'll be
I'd
John
say, and first of
Sassaman.
all, this has been an amazing conversation. I wish we could get all these people in a room together on a regular occasion. I'd say real quickly that we've been pretty good at defunding education and defunding healthcare and defunding social services. And what we're engaged in now is a conversation about how to move around the money to prevent crimes from happening that will make lives easier for law enforcement. It will make their job easier because somebody else will be handling some of those frontline responses. And I think that's a win-win. And so I think that's a good conversation that I think law enforcement will want to engage in because it makes their lives easier and it prevents people from entering the criminal justice funnel at the get-go. And so I think it's a good topic to tackle at this moment.
Thank you very much. And then John Sassaman, Chief Sassaman, police defunding, different, it depends on who you ask what that even means. But what's your response, your sense of it?
Here's my greatest concern is if we become nothing but a reactionary agency, we lose the relational work that is so important to policing. And if we are able to mitigate some of those mental health calls by earlier forms of intervention or different systems that mitigate those calls, I'm all for it. There will always be this need right now to communicate and be in conversation with our communities, all of our communities, so that we best understand, so that if Angel has a problem, she picks up that phone without even thinking twice and dialing 911 because she has full faith and trust in her police department. If we just jump quickly without having thoughtful conversation, we could really injure the relationship versus improve it.
So I do want to say that we have absolutely, this may be the longest CitySpeak in record, 2 hours. And I think that there's so many good questions that did not get asked. So I want to thank our questioners, and I'm wondering if you folks would be amenable to doing this again in sometime in the future, in the next few months. John, I'd ask you if you were, because there's no, we're already at 2 hours. Although you'll be retiring. So
my last day is actually next week. I've been in the business 32 years, and I will be stepping aside. But I will tell you, there's a great person who's stepping into the role.
And hopefully, in their role, they will come back. Randy, I assume you're game for another, right? And John Haroldson as well? Right. Okay. And I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. But I really do feel bad about some of these questions. There's just not time. And you've all given such good, comprehensive answers. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and turn the forum back to Stevie Beiswanger, of course, as the publisher, reminding you that if you have consumed this content tonight, if you are not subscribing, you are really not taking care of the people behind the scenes that work quite hard to put this together. So please do consider subscribing. Stevie.
Thanks, Steve. And a big thank you to all of our panelists tonight. I so appreciate you all being here. I thought it was a great event. Thank you, Chief Sassaman, for your years of service. And thank you for everything you all do. Also, thank you to our staff at The Advocate and our supporters who made tonight possible. Thank you to all of our viewers and your wonderful questions. And with that all said, the CitySpeak tonight is adjourned.